By the second day, this had stopped being a story about one minister losing his job. On July 17th, crowds gathered again outside the presidential office in Kyiv, and this time, the chants had shifted. The day before, people were angry that Mykhailo Fedorov had been removed as defense minister. Now they were demanding something more specific, that Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi be removed too, and that Fedorov be reinstated in his place. Zelensky's response after the first day of protests had been to say he understood and heard the public's concerns. Protesters read that as exactly what it was, an acknowledgement without an action, and they came back the next day in larger numbers to make the point again. What poured gasoline on this particular fire was a live stream from Serhiy Sternenko, one of the most prominent volunteer organizers and activists in Ukraine, someone who has spent years running one of the country's largest drone funding operations, and who has direct lines into units across the front. Sternenko had been serving as an informal advisor to Fedorov during his time as defense minister, a role that quietly ended along with Fedorov's own departure. On July 17th, visibly shaken, Sternenko went live and laid out a specific, detailed account of a failed assault near Pokrovsk, involving the 425th Separate Assault Regiment, known as Skelia. According to his account, Ukrainian troops became disoriented during the operation and mistakenly attacked the positions of a different Ukrainian brigade. A friendly fire incident followed. Soldiers on both sides were killed, including the men who had been sent forward on the original assault. Sternenko said that rather than investigating what happened and removing the regiment's commander, he found himself on the receiving end of an information campaign that tried to paint the whole account as invented. It's worth being precise about what is and isn't independently established here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a rumor and a documented fact can get flattened into the same sentence if you're not careful. The 425th Skelia Regiment was not, in fact, some obscure unit nobody had heard of before this livestream. It had already been the subject of a serious, separate scandal weeks earlier, after the Ukrainian outlet Babel published an investigation alleging brutal abuse of soldiers within the regiment, including beatings, and linking the unit to at least 25 or 26 non-combat deaths among recently mobilized recruits over roughly a 6-month stretch. That reporting was serious enough that Ukraine's own State Bureau of Investigation opened a probe, and the regiment's commander, Yuri Harkavy, was suspended from his post pending the outcome. Syrski himself, in a televised interview, publicly called the situation in the regiment a shameful story, said flatly that a soldier in a country at war should not be dying in the rear rather than preparing to fight at the front, and confirmed that an investigation was already underway, along with a review of every training ground where these deaths might have occurred. So the underlying pattern Sternenko was pointing to, a regiment with documented unusually high non-combat casualties, credibly linked to abuse, is not something invented for a live stream. It had already been established by independent journalism and acknowledged, at least in part, by Syrski's own command before this newest controversy broke. What Sternenko added on top of that documented scandal was a much more specific and much more serious claim, that the Pokrovsk friendly fire disaster happened not just because of chaos and poor training, but because Syrski's command structure had deliberately weakened that section of the front, withdrawing flank support and withholding replacements from a brigade whose commander had personally fallen out of favor, so that when Russian forces attacked, its defenses collapsed faster and the commander could be replaced with someone seen as more personally loyal. That is a much heavier accusation, effectively alleging that battlefield outcomes were being shaped by internal loyalty politics rather than military necessity, and it has not been independently verified the way the Skelia abuse allegations have. It deserves to be reported as exactly what it is, an extremely serious claim from a credible and well-connected source, made publicly and emotionally, that Ukrainian investigators and journalists will need to actually examine before anyone can responsibly call it established fact. The same caution has to apply, even more strongly, to some of the other claims circulating in the same wave of commentary. The idea, for instance, that Syrski might be a Russian intelligence asset because he was born in Russia and trained at a Soviet-era military academy before the Soviet Union's collapse. That is a serious allegation with no corroborating evidence behind it, and it's the kind of claim that spreads fast precisely because it's emotionally satisfying to people who are already furious at him for other, better documented reasons. Syrski's actual military biography, including his role in blunting Russia's initial assault on Kyiv in 2022, and later leading the recapture of territory around Kharkiv, is a matter of public record and doesn't require speculation about hidden loyalties to explain why people might reasonably criticize his leadership style on entirely different grounds. A highly centralized, top-down command culture that multiple analysts, not just Fedorov's allies, have described as excessively micromanaged and slow to adapt. Layered on top of all this is Ukraine's mobilization crisis. which long predates this week's political drama, and which several of the loudest voices in this controversy are explicitly tying back to Syrski's command. Ukraine's own human rights ombudsman has publicly acknowledged the problem of so-called buzzification, a term that's entered common usage to describe forced, sometimes violent street detentions by territorial recruitment center officials trying to meet conscription quotas. Zelensky himself has said publicly that eliminating these practices needs to be a top priority for whoever ends up running the defense ministry next. Separately, a different and equally troubling scandal has been unfolding around the 155th Anne of Kyiv Brigade, a unit originally built up with French training and support as a flagship modernization project, whose former chief of staff was arrested this month in connection with an alleged kidnapping and killing of civilians, in a case unrelated to the earlier abuse allegations, but that has deepened the broader sense that discipline and accountability inside parts of the army have badly frayed. Syrski ordered that case investigated too, and said publicly that anyone found responsible would be held accountable regardless of rank or prior service. None of this proves or disproves the specific claim that battlefield decisions are being made on the basis of personal loyalty rather than military logic, but it does establish, beyond reasonable dispute, that Ukraine has a real and serious problem with abuse, non-combat deaths, and accountability failures inside specific units, and that this problem long predates this week's protests. All of this is landing at a moment when morale is an openly acknowledged strategic vulnerability, not just a talking point. Reports of desertion and unauthorized absence from Ukrainian units have been a persistent, documented issue throughout the war's later years, driven by exhaustion, distrust of command, and, for some, direct experience or secondhand knowledge of exactly the kind of abuse allegations now surfacing publicly. Whether the specific claim that roughly 200,000 people have deserted or gone absent without leave since the invasion began is precisely accurate is difficult to verify from outside Ukraine's own military justice system. But the broader trend it's pointing to, a manpower and morale crisis serious enough that Ukraine's own president has named it as the central task for his next defense minister, is not in dispute among analysts following the war closely. So what does the second day of protests actually tell us? It tells us that Fedorov's dismissal has become a lightning rod for a much older, much broader set of grievances about how Ukraine's military is run, who gets protected when things go wrong, and whether reform-minded outsiders can ever actually change an institution built on decades of Soviet-style hierarchy. Some of what's being alleged this week is solidly documented, independently investigated, and already acknowledged by the military's own command. Some of it is a serious, credible, but so far unverified accusation from a well-placed source that deserves real investigation rather than either dismissal or automatic belief. And some of it, particularly the darkest and most inflammatory claims circulating on social media, is speculation dressed up as certainty, spreading, because it fits a narrative people already want to believe rather than because anyone has actually proven it. Separating those three categories, rather than treating everything said in the heat of this week as equally established, is going to matter enormously for what Ukraine's leadership, its parliament, and its Western partners actually do next. A few threads are worth watching to see where this actually goes rather than where the loudest voices say it's going. One is whether Ukraine's State Bureau of Investigation, which already had the Skelia abuse case open before this week, extends its inquiry to specifically examine the Pokrovsk friendly fire incident Sternenko described, and whether it does so transparently enough that both sides of this argument can see the same facts. A credible, independent finding either way would do more to settle this than another week of live streams and press conferences. The second is whether Zelensky's acknowledgement that he hears the protesters translates into any actual change in Syrski's authority or role, or whether, as happened after the Anti-Corruption Bureau protests a year earlier, the pattern repeats itself only under sustained pressure rather than an early concession. A third is what happens to the officers and advisors around Fedorov, who have already stepped back or resigned in the days since his dismissal, since their departure or retention will say a lot about whether any of his reform agenda survives him. And a fourth, which matters just as much for people actually fighting this war as any of the political maneuvering in Kyiv, is whether the specific documented problems already on the table, abuse inside particular units, coercive mobilization tactics, and a manpower shortage serious enough that the president himself has named it as his next defense minister's central task, get addressed on their own terms, independent of who wins the argument over who should hold which title. Ukraine's soldiers on the front line are dealing with the consequences of these institutional failures, regardless of how this particular political crisis resolves, and that reality doesn't wait for a press conference to catch up with it.